The road was unlit and narrow enough that the plows never cleared it evenly. Snow packed hard along the edges and thin toward the center where passing tires had worn it smooth and slick. Tall pines lined both sides, planted close together, their trunks catching the headlights only at the base before disappearing upward into darkness. The tops were never visible, even on clear nights, leaving less sky than the road suggested there should be. Once the pavement entered the trees, there were no markers and no shoulder, only a continuous curve that tightened and released without pattern. This stretch was driven often enough to remove uncertainty. Certain curves held ice longer than the rest, especially after days when the sun never reached the road. Plows stopped coming through after the first mile, and the pavement dipped just enough in places to pull a vehicle offline if corrections came too late. Nothing about being here at that hour was unusual. The conditions were known, expected, and required attention every time. The heater worked hard enough to keep the windshield clear, but never warmed the car completely. Cold stayed in the metal and the glass, settling into the interior no matter how long the engine ran. The tires sounded different here, the contact with the road alternating between muted grip and a faint hollow slide that corrected itself almost immediately. Speed stayed consistent. Braking came early and gently, well before it was necessary, the way it always did on this stretch. There was no hurry to get through it, only the need to keep moving. A stretch of pavement ahead looked darker than the rest, a shallow dip where meltwater always collected before freezing again. The correction came automatically, easing off the accelerator, hands steady, eyes fixed where the headlights cut the road into shape. The tires responded as expected at first, a familiar resistance that held just long enough to feel normal. Then the contact changed. Not all at once, just enough to register. The rear of the car slid sideways without warning. There was no time to overcorrect, only a brief tightening of the grip before the road let go completely. The impact came hard and close, metal striking packed snow and wood in quick succession, the sound contained by the trees. When the car stopped, it did so abruptly. Angled across the road, engine still running. For a moment, nothing moved. It took longer than expected for Paul's hands to steady. His breathing stayed shallow for a few seconds before settling into something usable. The engine continued to idle, its sound steady and unchanged. The headlights pointed off-road now, illuminating a narrow stand of trees at an angle that made a distance hard to judge. Steam lifted from the hood and disappeared quickly into the cold. The smell of coolant reached the interior a moment later, faint but unmistakable. The door resisted when it opened, bent slightly inward from the impact. It gave with a sharp pull, releasing into the snow. Cold rushed in immediately. One tire sat half off the pavement, the front end angled toward the trees, the rear still blocking the road. Snow and broken branches were packed into the wheel well, pressed there by the force of the slide. The damage was clear but limited. The car hadn't rolled. The frame appeared intact. After clearing what he could from the well, he got back inside. The tires spun briefly before catching. The car shifted, then straightened. When it moved forward, the dark-colored sedan did so without resistance, easing back onto the road as if it never left it. The car carried differently after the impact. A low vibration ran through the steering wheel that hadn't been there before, subtle enough to ignore but persistent enough to notice. Speed stayed well below what the road allowed. Corrections came more often now, smaller and closer together, as if the pavement required constant negotiation. Snow clicked against the undercarriage and fell away behind him in uneven bursts. The road straightened briefly, opening into a stretch where the trees pulled back just enough to let darkness spread wider. Ahead, distant lights appeared through the branches, white at first, then red, moving steadily in the opposite direction. The sound reached him a moment later. Sirens muted by distance and trees, their rise and fall stretched thin by the cold air. They passed without slowing, an ambulance first, then a police cruiser close behind it, both heading toward the curve where he had already come from. The lights vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The road narrowed again. The trees closed back in. Snow resumed its steady pattern beneath the tires, and the drive continued forward without interruption. The road ended without ceremony. Trees thinned, the pavement widened slightly, and the last curve opened onto a small clearing where the car slowed on its own. A single structure sat back from the road, its outline barely visible until the headlights washed across it. He pulled them beside the building and shut the engine off. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the drive had. Inside, the lights came on one room at a time. The power held. Heat followed slowly, pushing cold back into the corners but never fully driving it out. Snow melted from his boots and darkened the floor by the entryway. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the building settle into itself, a familiar sequence of sounds returning in the same order they always did. The building required someone to remain when others were gone. Not to live there exactly, but to keep systems from failing quietly in the absence of use. A seasonal operations facility, closed to the winter and kept functional so it wouldn't degrade while no one was meant to be there. Heat, power, and basic functions degraded faster when left alone. Until then, Paul's presence was enough. He moved through the rooms automatically, checking what required confirmation and ignoring what did not. The damage to the car stayed outside, unaddressed for now. There would be time for that later. Nothing inside demanded immediate attention. Everything that should have been working was, which meant his work, for the moment, was finished. On top of the desk near the front door sat a bound logbook, its cover worn smooth from use. Each day was marked the same way. Date, time, brief notes confirming that everything remained within expected limits while the building sat unused. Most entries were the same. That was the point. The log existed to show continuity more than detail, proof that nothing had been missed simply because no one was watching. The log existed only to document routine operation, confirmation that systems functioned and that the day had passed without incident. He filled it out at the same times every day, often without looking back at previous entries. Whatever mattered would announce itself. Until then, the record stayed quiet by design. When he finally sat down, the silence returned, complete and uninterrupted. The drive was already receding, filing itself away with the rest of the night that had come before it. Outside, the road remained dark and empty, doing what it always did. Sleep came unevenly. The building held heat through the night, but the cold could never fully release its grip, settling back in whenever the furnace cycled off. Paul woke up more than once without knowing why. The quiet intact each time he opened his eyes. Nothing outside had changed. The dock remained complete. When sleep returned, it did so briefly and without depth. By the time light reached the windows, it had already passed through the trees. What arrived inside was thin and colorless, more suggestion than illumination. The time on the clock was later than it felt. Paul stood, worked the stiffness from his legs, and moved through the same room as the night before. Everything was where it had been. Nothing required immediate attention. The damage to the car was clear in the daylight. Scratches ran along the side panel, shallow but numerous. One taillight was cracked. Snow had hardened again around the wheel well overnight, holding what remained in place. Beyond the clearing, the road looked unchanged, pale and empty. Inside, he turned the radio on at a low volume, not for information or enjoyment, but to break the quiet into something manageable. He let it run while he moved through the space, catching fragments without listening closely. Weather, road conditions, the ordinary cadence of a morning. A familiar tone cut through it briefly, then passed. He did not stop what he was doing. It wasn't until the report repeated, slower this time, that his attention settled. The voice on the radio shifted slightly, the cadence slowing as if to make room for what followed. A single vehicle accident had occurred overnight on a rural access road outside of town. Conditions were cited as a factor. The report named the road and the approximate time, both delivered without emphasis. Emergency services had responded shortly after the incident was reported. The vehicle had left the roadway on a curve where snow and ice were known to collect. Damage was described as significant. Authorities stated that the road had been temporarily closed while the scene was cleared. An ambulance and a police unit were dispatched from the nearest station. There was no mention of another vehicle, no mention of witnesses. The report ended with a brief advisory about winter travel and moved on to the next item. At first, the words passed through without settling. Paul kept moving, letting the report occupy the same space as the rest of the morning noise. Road names came and went, times blurred together. It sounded like dozens of similar items he'd heard before. Then a detail caught and held. The curve was mentioned again, described as a known problem spot after snowfall. The timing followed, overnight, early enough that no traffic had been on the road yet. The phrasing was precise in a way that stood out, anchored to specifics rather than general caution. He stopped what he was doing without fully realizing it, standing still as the voice continued. The car was described next. Not the make, not the color, just where it had come to rest, partially blocking the roadway, off the pavement but close enough to require closure while it was cleared. The report moved on quickly after that, transitioning back into weather without pause. The radio kept playing. He didn't turn it off. He stepped outside without deciding to. The cold felt sharper than it had earlier. The air thinner, as if the night hadn't fully let go yet. Snow crunched underfoot in a way that sounded louder than it should have. He stood for a moment in the clearing, listening. Then his attention turned back toward the road. The car sat where he left it. In the daylight, it looked smaller somehow, more contained. The damage hadn't changed. The cracked taillight, the scratches along the side panel that caught light in certain angles, then disappeared again. Nothing about it suggested urgency. Nothing suggested it shouldn't be there. He walked towards the edge of the pavement and looked up the road, then back the way he'd come. The curve was visible now, pale against the trees, its shape ordinary in the morning light. There were no new tracks, no signs of activity beyond what he already knew had happened. The road remained open and empty in both directions. He stood there longer than necessary, not waiting for anything in particular. The report replayed itself in pieces, out of order, details brushing against memory without settling into place. Eventually, the cold reached through his coat and made the decision for him. He turned back toward the building and went inside. He returned to the interior of the building and resumed the work the morning required. The order mattered less than repetition. Certain checks were done because they always had been, not because anything suggested they were needed now. The building existed between uses, maintained during long stretches when no one else was meant to occupy it. His responsibility was to keep it from slipping into disrepair, to make sure it would be ready when it was called on again. Presence was part of that. Things failed more slowly when someone was there to notice. He moved through the routine without interruption. Readings held steady. Nothing required adjustment. Each system responded the way it was supposed to, confirming continuity through function alone. If something had gone wrong overnight, there was no evidence of it now. The radio continued in the background. The report did not repeat, but its absence felt noticeable, like a phrase cut off mid-thought. He found himself waiting for it without realizing he was doing so. When the morning routines were finished, he checked the time again. It matched what he expected. Still, the sense that something had been skipped lingered, unresolved. Not a problem. Not yet. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, unsure what should come next. The routine usually answered the question on its own. This time, it didn't. The radio cut back in with a brief tone, then resumed in a voice that sounded unchanged from before. The update was short, delivered as if it were a correction rather than new information. Authorities confirmed that the dark-colored sedan involved in the overnight accident had been removed from the roadway earlier this morning. The road had been reopened shortly after. No further advisories were issued. There was a pause, just long enough to suggest the report had concluded, before one final line was added. The driver was declared deceased at the scene. No additional details were provided. The phrasing was precise, official, finished. Paul stood where he was, listening as the broadcast moved on without hesitation. Weather followed, then traffic. The cadence returned to normal, as though nothing had been interrupted. When he turned the radio off, the room felt no different than it had before. The silence settled easily, without resistance. For a moment, the report refused to organize itself. The details existed, but they wouldn't line up. Road, curve, overnight conditions, response time. Each piece matched something that he remembered, but never all at once. Taken individually, they were harmless. Together, they formed a shape that didn't fit anywhere it was being placed. He replayed the sequence in his head, not as it had sounded on the radio, but as it had happened. The slide, the impact, the way the car had stopped short of trees. The engine still running, the road empty in both directions. He had left the scene under his own power. The car was here. He was here. That should have ended it. He checked the time again, then the date. Both were correct. The radio hadn't misspoken. The phrasing had been careful, deliberate. Declared deceased. Not missing, not unidentified. Finished. The confusion sharpened rather than resolved. If the report was wrong, it was wrong in a way that didn't make sense. There were too many steps involved, too many confirmations. Mistakes like that weren't made casually. They required agreement. He moved through the building again, retracing what he had already done. The rooms responded as expected. The systems answered when checked. The space recognized him without hesitation. Nothing inside suggested absence. Outside, the road remained opened. No cones, no tape, no evidence that anything had happened at all. He stood in the doorway between the two and tried to reconcile them. The explanations hovered just out of reach, close enough to suggest itself but never settle. If the report wasn't about him, then it had to be about someone else. But there had been no one else. And if it was about him, then there was no place for that fact to settle. The thought arrived fully formed and immediately rejected. That can't be right. But nothing replaced it. Paul started with what made the most sense. The phone on the wall still had a dial tone. He had lifted the receiver and held it there for a moment, listening to the steady, unbroken sound. It didn't hesitate. It didn't waver. He dialed a number he knew by memory and waited. The line rang longer than it should have. When it stopped, it did so without connecting, the tone returning as if nothing had been attempted. No message followed, no explanation. He tried again, pressing the numbers more deliberately this time. The results were the same. He set the receiver back in place and stood there, watching it, half expecting something else to happen. Nothing did. Outside, the road remained unchanged. He stepped to its edge and looked both ways, scanning for movement that never came. No traffic passed. No distant engine sound carried through the trees. The quiet felt procedural now, less like absence and more like clearance, as though whatever had happened here had already been processed and approved. Back inside, he opened the logbook that was kept on the desk. The pages were intact. His handwriting filled the most recent entries, steady and familiar. Dates, notes, observations recorded without emphasis. He turned to the next blank line and rested the pen there, waiting for the entry to suggest itself. It didn't. The radio stayed off. The silence no longer felt neutral, but it wasn't hostile either. It behaved like something finished, complete and uninterested in revision. He moved through the building again, slower this time, touching surfaces he hadn't before, grounding himself in small confirmations that still responded correctly. The building recognized him, the systems held, the lights answered when asked. Whatever decisions had been made elsewhere hadn't reached this far yet. He stood by the window and looked out across the clearing, waiting for a response that didn't arrive. Not a siren, not a knock, not a correction. Just continuation. As the day wore on, the building remained unchanged. The quiet persisted without interruption. At the usual time, Paul gathered his things. That was when the gap became unavoidable. There was no step that followed, no expected action, no next task implied by the one before it. The routine ended cleanly, not early, not late, just finished. Paul stood there, aware for the first time that every day he could remember had been shaped by what came next. A drive, a return, a place where his presence would be accounted for. That expectation had always existed, even when no one spoke it aloud. Now it didn't. The accident had not removed him from the world. It had placed him out of sequence. Whatever came next no longer included him. Paul could leave if he chose to. The road was open. The car would start. But there was no longer any indication that leaving would place him anywhere recognizable. He remained where he was, not out of fear,